Quad leaders meeting scheduled to take place in Sydney next week has been cancelled. US President Biden suddenly scrapped his trip to Australia, but has offered Prime Minister Albanese a state visit to Washington later in the year.
Negotiations took place between the Australian, United States, Japanese and Indian governments overnight following Joe Biden's decision to not attend Australia or Papua New Guinea following the G7 leaders meeting scheduled for Hiroshima. The reason that Joe Biden is not attending is because there are negotiations ongoing in the United States in regards to the debt ceiling. So he apologised to Anthony Albanese and said that he would postpone his trip here to Australian Parliament, where he was due to give an address in Canberra, and as well that Quad leaders meeting to take place at the Sydney Opera House in Sydney. That has now been cancelled.
The Quad leaders meeting will not be going ahead in Sydney next week. We, though, will be having that discussion between Quad leaders in Japan.
I'm cutting my trip short. I'm postponing the Australia portion of the trip and my stop in Papua New Guinea. And I spoke today with Prime Minister Albanese of Australia and a short time ago and let him know what was going on.
The White House has confirmed that Joe Biden offered a state visit to Anthony Albanese, which will be later this year. A state visit has taken place in the past. This will be the first invitation for a state visit from Joe Biden to Anthony Albanese.
President Biden, though, indicated that he was very much looking forward to coming down at a future date when it can be arranged, and I will visit the United States for a state visit later this year.
As for the Quad, the Prime Minister insists that all four leaders will meet on the sidelines of the G7 to ensure that the outcomes and also aims that were set down for that meeting in Sydney are discussed.
Joining me now is James Brown. He's one of the council members at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. James, thank you for your time as always. These things happen, I guess, when you're dealing with the United States, but it's not ideal given the Prime Minister and others were very keen to get the Quad front and centre next week.
Look, these things do happen. Presidents have to change their schedule, but I think there's two things that are important here. Firstly, this debt ceiling crisis was predictable. These things come around like clockwork. They've happened many times before. So for our Prime Minister to be standing up last night, still declaring that President Biden would visit, and then to have that decision overturned by the time we woke up this morning is embarrassing. It's short notice. The US should have done a better job of it than this. I think the other thing that's important here is President Biden chose not to send Vice President Harris. When Bill Clinton had to cancel his trip to the APEC summit back in the 90s, he was able to send his Vice President along. I think there's no trust here that Vice President Harris could fill the role and do the job.